Today we're going to review the very last unit of the year about the post-World War II years. The first topic is the booming 1950s. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as two superpowers with vastly different political and economic systems. During the war, Soviet and American leaders had met at the Yalta Conference and decided how to divide Europe after the defeat of Hitler. It was there, in 1945, that the Allies agreed to divide Germany and Berlin into zones of occupation. Stalin had promised to have free elections in the Eastern European countries he occupied, but only months later at the Potsdam Conference, Stalin revoked his promise of free elections, creating an arc of satellite states on its western border. Despite the positive developments at these wartime conferences, like the founding of the United Nations, the Declaration of Human Rights, GATT, the WTO, and the IMF, relations between the two superpowers were actually worsening, starting the Cold War. One reason for the start of the Cold War was the conflicting ideologies of the United States and Soviet Union. Another was a disagreement over Eastern Europe. Truman wanted strong, stable democracies in Europe to prevent totalitarianism and to provide a market to sell U.S. products. Stalin wanted control of Eastern Europe to protect against another invasion and rebuild the Soviet economy. To achieve his goals, Stalin controlled the satellite states, spurring Churchill to declare that an Iron Curtain had divided Europe. To stop further Soviet influence in Europe, the Truman administration adopted the Truman Doctrine, a policy of containment which dedicated the United States to sending military and economic aid to any country trying to prevent a communist takeover. To rebuild Western Europe after the war and encourage capitalism, the Marshall Plan provided billions of dollars to those nations that cooperated with the U.S. The U.S. also formed a defensive alliance of European nations called NATO, as well as in Asia, called SEATO. In reaction, the Soviet Union formed its own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. The Cold War soon began to heat up. Stalin tried to blockade West Berlin, but the Berlin airlift in 1948 succeeded in maintaining the city's freedom. In China, Mao Zedong defeated Chiang Kai-shek after a long civil war, establishing a communist republic in that country. Korea, divided into two zones, was the site of a full-blown war. North Korea was supported by the Soviets and Chinese, and South Korea was backed by the United States. For 3 years, the Americans fought the North Koreans until a war ended in a stalemate. An arms race was in full swing. Both the U.S. and the USSR had atomic and thermonuclear weapons, and were competing in space. The USSR launched the first satellite, Sputnik 1, and the United States tried to catch up. The Eisenhower administration extended its containment policy to the Middle East and Latin America, where the CIA overthrew leftist governments in Iran and Guatemala in an effort to stop the spread of communism. The Cold War greatly affected Americans at home. People were scared that communist subversives in America would attack. The cases of Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs, who were accused of espionage, further flamed the Red Scare that was beginning to develop. A massive hysteria spread throughout the nation when Senator McCarthy and the HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, accused countless Americans of subversion, including the Hollywood 10. Most of McCarthy's accusations were unsubstantiated, and he soon lost public support. For most people, however, the 1950s was a period of prosperity. The economy boomed, and more people had white-collar jobs. President Truman took the first steps to address civil rights by integrating the armed forces and government offices. This angered conservatives who undermined his legislative goals. The conservatives overrode his veto on the Taft-Hartley Act, resulting in diminished rights for unions. Eisenhower was next elected president, who changed America by building the interstate highway system. Car ownership increased, and more families moved to the suburbs. Due to television, the movies, and the radio, America developed a uniform consumer culture, fueled by the popularity of TV shows and rock and roll music. The Beat Poets, however, rebelled against this materialistic culture. The turbulent 60s. The 1960 election was an incredibly close showdown between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. Kennedy won the election by a small margin, despite his Catholic faith, due to his excellent performance in the first televised presidential debates. The new Kennedy administration faced some of the most dangerous Soviet confrontations. In 1960, Fidel Castro had seized power in Cuba and declared himself a communist dictator. A plan had been devised under Eisenhower to have Cuban exiles land in Cuba and overthrow Castro, but this Bay of Pigs invasion was a total failure. A year later, U.S. spy planes flying over Cuba took photographs showing the Soviets were building nuclear missile bases. The Cuban Missile Crisis that followed almost resulted in war, but was resolved when the United States agreed not to invade Cuba if the Soviets removed the missiles. And then the next year, in Berlin, the Soviets built a wall separating West and East Berlin. Before his assassination, John F. Kennedy had tried to initiate domestic reforms called the New Frontier, but a conservative Congress blocked most of his measures. Kennedy did succeed in creating NASA, the Peace Corps, and the Alliance for Progress. Lyndon B. Johnson, who took over in 1963, used JFK's legacy to enact many far-reaching reforms. His program, called the Great Society, was a war on poverty and prejudice. Medicaid and Medicare provided health care for the poor and elderly. The Immigration Act of 1965 eliminated national origin quotas and increased immigration's ethnic diversity. The Great Society also funded the building of public housing, offered increased protection to consumers and the environment, increased funding for education, and provided new job opportunities like AmeriCorps and Job Corps. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in public facilities, and the Voting Rights Act removed restrictions on voting, such as literacy tests. Now more on civil rights. Lyndon B. Johnson's laws for civil rights were the great achievement of a long history of activism by African Americans. After the Civil War, Reconstruction had failed to give blacks equal status in society. The Supreme Court case, Plessy v. Ferguson, in 1897 actually legalized segregation. But in 1954, under the leadership of Chief Justice Earl Warren, the Supreme Court overrode the earlier decision in the landmark case Brown v. the Board of Education. The Supreme Court ruled that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal, and segregated schools were declared unconstitutional. Within a year after the Brown case, more than 500 school districts had desegregated, but in some areas, leaders vowed resistance. In Arkansas, the governor ordered the National Guard to prevent 9 black students from enrolling at Little Rock's Central High School. President Eisenhower had to use federal troops to force the state to let the students attend the high school. Another drive for civil rights had risen over segregation of city buses. An African American woman named Rosa Parks had refused to yield her seat to a white man. After her arrest, blacks in Montgomery, Alabama, organized a year-long boycott of the city's bus system. The crisis ended when a Supreme Court ruling ruled that segregated buses were illegal. Helping lead the bus boycott was Martin Luther King Jr., a minister who later formed the Southern Christian Leadership Council, or SCLC. King taught the techniques of nonviolent resistance to unjust laws. By 1960, another group was formed, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, made up mostly of college students. SNCC organized sit-ins to protest segregation at restaurants. The last major civil rights group was the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, led by James Farmer. CORE organized the Freedom Rides to protest segregation on interstate buses. After John F. Kennedy, the president at the time, saw the violence against these civil rights protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, on the television, he proposed a civil rights amendment. In support of this proposal, Martin Luther King Jr. organized a great march on Washington to support the law, where he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. But John F. Kennedy never lived to see this dream come true. Instead, it was Lyndon B. Johnson who signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. The 24th Amendment, which outlawed poll taxes, soon followed. Disagreements among civil rights groups and the rise of Black nationalism created a violent period in the fight for civil rights. In the North, the problem was de facto segregation, which arose from racist attitudes, not racist laws. Anger at de facto segregation boiled over in several riots that brought many deaths and much destruction, such as in Watts, Los Angeles. New African American leaders arose, arguing that not enough was being done fast enough. Malcolm X, a Black nationalist belonging to the Nation of Islam, told his audiences to use armed self-defense when unlawfully attacked. Other younger members of the civil rights movement split with Martin Luther King and used the slogan Black Power to symbolize their call for Black pride and stronger resistance to racism. The Black Panthers adopted military-style dress and harsh words, raising fears among moderate African Americans and many whites. The Vietnam War. After World War II, Vietnamese communists led by Ho Chi Minh fought the French for independence. When they won, the United States intervened and created a separate country, South Vietnam, which they aided as part of containment policy. Opponents of U.S. intervention, the Viet Cong, started attacking the government of South Vietnam and organizing to reunite South with North Vietnam. Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy gradually increased U.S. aid to South Vietnam between the years 1954 and 1963 to fight against these Viet Cong guerrillas. When U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin were attacked in 1964 by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, President Johnson secured the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed the president to increase troop involvement. Quickly, Johnson increased the number of American troops in Vietnam from 16,000 to over 250,000. Johnson hoped for a quick victory, but it did not happen. Disapproval of the president's policies spread and unrest grew around the nation. Massive anti-war protests rocked the nation. 1968 in particular was a tumultuous year. The Tet Offensive, a massive Viet Cong attack all throughout South Vietnam, caused many Americans to question the war. Johnson's popularity fell, and he declared he would not run for re-election. Soon after, the nation was stunned by the murders of civil rights leader Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, who was campaigning for the Democratic nomination for president. The resulting political turmoil plunged the Democratic National Convention in Chicago into chaos. The winner of that year's election was Richard Nixon, who promised a plan to end the war in Vietnam. On reaching the White House, Nixon began to withdraw American troops in Vietnam as part of his Vietnamization strategy. He also ordered massive bombings of North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Students protesting against this bombing at Kent State were attacked by the National Guard, resulting in 4 deaths. Support for the war eroded in Congress. People were so upset by the Vietnam War that Congress passed the War Powers Act, limiting the power of the president to send troops into military combat. In 1973, all parties agreed to a peace. However, in 1975, North Vietnam conquered South Vietnam. The 1970s and the 1980s. In the 1970s, the civil rights movement spread to other groups. Latinos began to demand equal rights and respect for their culture and heritage. Mexicans were the largest immigrant group in California, mostly working in agriculture. Cesar Chavez organized these farm workers into a union called the United Farm Workers in order to boost wages and improve conditions. By calling for a nationwide boycott of grapes, Chavez successfully pressured grape owners into recognizing his union and granting a new, more favorable contract. Native Americans also began demanding equal rights. Concerned about the high unemployment rate, poor health care, and high death rate, many Native Americans joined together to try to work for change. The feminist movement also grew in the 1970s, spurred by dissatisfaction in the workplace. Women found certain jobs closed to them and were generally paid much less than men, even for the same job. Feminist leaders like Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem organized the National Organization of Women, or NOW, to fight for women's rights. Concern for the environment also grew in the 70s. This was spurred by Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring. 1970 marked the country's first National Earth Day. President Nixon, who was elected in 1968 and then re-elected in 1972, at first had political success. Nixon began pulling out troops from Vietnam and pursued policies of détente with the Soviet Union. He signed the SALT Arms Limitation Agreement and visited Communist China for the first time. Domestically, Nixon pursued conservative policies, but faced economic troubles. In 1973, the oil-producing nations formed a cartel, OPEC, and put an embargo on oil shipped to America. The result was skyrocketing oil prices and inflation. The final straw for Nixon was the Watergate scandal. A crime under investigation revealed that Nixon was involved in a massive cover-up and had taped Oval Office conversations that could be used as evidence. When Nixon refused to release the tapes, the Supreme Court ruled that he was obligated to share them. The ensuing investigations so severely undermined the nation's confidence in their president that Nixon realized that he had to resign. Gerald Ford became the next president, and he pardoned Nixon from any crime he may have committed. But the nation wanted change. In 1976, the people elected a Democrat, Jimmy Carter. Unfortunately, Carter's term as president was marred by many troubles. The most notable was the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, in which 52 Americans were held hostage by militant Iranian students. Carter worked day and night to free the hostages, but it wasn't until Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980 that they were finally released. Reagan was president for 2 terms. Near the end of his second term, Reagan flew to West Berlin where he issued a famous speech condemning the Soviet Union. The U.S. and the Soviet Union had been in a Cold War since 1945, and in 1989 it was apparent that the USSR was weakening. Reagan challenged the USSR to tear down the Berlin Wall, which had long been the symbol of the Cold War. Soon after, the Soviet satellite states began to declare independence from the Soviet Union, and in 1991 the Soviet Union collapsed, signaling the end of the Cold War.